Welcome to Happily Ever After is just the beginning. Keeping your relationship not just together, but happy, and we mean truly happy, is part art and part science. You've come to the right place. Here's your host, Leslie Dories.
My being angry never used to scare me. Other people, yes. Me, And I learned to be angry at a really young age because it was the only way I ever was heard in my family. And unfortunately, it didn't really serve me then. And in fact, I actually developed a reputation for being angry. But like so many people, my anger was a defense. No one could get close enough to hurt me. Or so I thought. I fell in love, got angry, and they left. So not really a solution to the whole not get hurt thing. But luckily, the last time I fell in love and got angry, he didn't leave. He just asked me to handle it differently. And there began my journey to controlling my anger instead of having it control me. So I know that it's possible. And anger and its effects on us and our relationship is what we're going to be talking about today. And to help with this discussion, I'm joined by author and clinical psychologist, Dr. Kelly Flannagan. Kelly, thanks so much for coming back on the show and talking about what is, one, an ever-present problem, and two, right now really highlighted in our world. So thanks so much.
Oh yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me. And yes, it couldn't be a more timely discussion right now, could it?
No. So because back I think it was in August. I think it was a blog you wrote that showed up in August. You wrote about anger, and you specifically identified 4 different kinds of anger. Who knew there were different kinds? You did. But anyway, so can you first talk a little bit about what anger actually is and what makes it problematic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the assumption is that anger is problematic, and that comes more from some of the ways that we sort of let anger be in charge of us rather than us being in charge of it. So some of the ways that we end up expressing anger could be really problematic. You're kind to be vulnerable in the introduction and explain one of those ways yourself, being angry in a way that sort of drives people away. And here your goal is to end up being in a sense of safety with somebody, and instead you end up feeling alone, and which is obviously not the goal of a relationship. So yeah, it's that expression of anger. I hope this isn't too immature, but one of the favorite lessons I learned about anger was 2015, where this great movie called Inside Out came out, a Disney animated film. Did you ever see it?
Oh yeah, it's a great movie.
Yeah, great movie. It's about what's going on in this little girl's head and these 5 emotions, and how they're sort of at first these emotions are working at odds with each other, and one of the emotions is anger. And I remember reading an article shortly after that movie came out, and this is what struck me about it. And they said it's the first animated kids film that the author could identify, and I think it's true, where there wasn't a villain. There was no villain. The plot was The plot was driven by not fighting back against a villain, but helping this little girl learning how to get all of her emotions working together. And so sometimes I think anger becomes a problem because we turn it into a villain. We think it's the bad guy that we aren't allowed to feel, that we should hide or stuff down or whatever. And then I think on the other side of it, honestly, it becomes a problem because we sort of turn it into our superhero. It's strong and it's powerful, and we use it to get things done in the world, but in a way that ultimately isn't healthy. And so I think the idea here is, instead of making anger our villain or our superhero, it's how do we just acknowledge that anger is an emotion amongst other emotions, and as an emotion, it's information. It's information about what's mattering to us, what we fear, what we want, what's hurting, and if we can sort of be curious about it as information, then we can learn from it and learn what to do with it.
Yeah, and I love that, because that's one of the things that I always talk with my clients about is especially a lot of the men I work with who don't who don't like the whole concept of emotion. They find emotion to be, illogical. I feel like I'm, like Mr. Spock in Star Trek. It's illogical and it's not helpful. But emotion actually I don't like using the word primitive, but for lack of a better word, it's the primitive brain's way of giving us information that we really need to have right now without having to spend time thinking about it. And,
right.
And so I love the idea of people becoming curious about it, about, what is this, what's happening. I remember, and anybody who's a parent probably remembers screaming at their kid at some point in time because their kid was doing something dangerous and the parent was afraid. I mean, I remember when my son was little, we were at a gas station and he was going to the bathroom, and instead of looking as he crossed, over, he wasn't, and there was this car, and I just screamed at him, and because I was terrified he was going to get hit. I mean, but to anybody who heard me, who didn't see the situation, would have thought, wow, that mom is really out of control. So, I mean, that was just that
right.
That primitive anger of, oh, my God, this person who I care about so much is about to get killed.
Yeah, and I think you're making a really good point, which is, when someone says that anger is illogical, my response to something like that is often to say, absolutely it is. There are all sorts of data. There's data that comes from logic, and there's data that comes from feeling and intuition. And so anger is part of the illogical data. But if you tell me that you only value logical data and not all the rest of the data that's going on within us all the time, then you're missing out on a lot of your human experience, and you actually aren't going to be super informed about why you're choosing to do the things that you do, how you're reacting to people. Let's welcome in the rest of the data so that we can understand ourselves and others better.
Yeah, and I love that. So I want to tackle, start going into the 4 types of anger that you talk about. And the first type of anger that you identify is something you call defensive anger. And so what is it? What are the symptoms, or I should say characteristics, of defensive anger? And how does it create challenges in our relationships?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that you hadn't seen anger broken down into 4 types. I was actually giving a talk at an event earlier this year before COVID hit. Actually, the last thing I did before COVID hit, and my wife was at it, fortunately, and she kind of challenged me after one question I had about anger to get a little more specific, and actually that's where these 4 types came from as we talked about it. She's a child psychologist, and she sort of helped me parse it out.
Which is really good to help children understand, not just children, but all of us to understand anger.
And that's honestly, I give her an awful lot of credit, because I think that's where she was coming from, that child developmental perspective, and saying like, hey, not all anger is defensive anger. Sometimes kids have anger because they're frustrated, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, in a minute. But the defensive anger piece, you've already actually started to do a really great job of introducing in your introduction. I think of defensive anger like this. I think that we all come into the world with a true self that is good and beautiful and worthy of love and belonging. And at some point, all of us begin to doubt that when we encounter a message that is called shame. And shame is the message each of us get that we are not worthy of love and belonging exactly the way we are, right? And so most of us as kids, we get that shame message pretty early on in life, whether it's from a parent who might be doing the best that they can, or peers, or teachers, or whatever. And so what we do as kids is we start to develop, basically kids are smart. They go, okay, if my true self isn't good enough to earn me love and belonging, then I'm going to build a self that is. I'm going to build a false self that will get me that love and belonging, or at least protect me from more of this shame stuff, more of this hurt, right? And so I talk about how we go through a process. Really, we had 3 components to our false self. One is the sort of the walls that we hide behind. And you see those walls develop in kids early in life, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. They start to put their true self away and try to blend into their peer groups so that they fit in. Then eventually, usually around middle school to high school, we start to add that more angry, aggressive, defensive anger component to the false self, like hey, like you said in your introduction, the best defense is a good offense, like strike first before you get hurt, those sorts of things, right? And this false self isn't bad. I mean, it's protecting you. It's doing what you think it needs to do to stay safe. It's not a bad thing, but it can have negative consequences, as you pointed out. Like, the goal is to belong, and yet you end up lonelier than ever. And
it gets lonely behind that wall that you build up.
It gets, the more, as you hide behind that wall and fire cannons at people from the top of it like a castle, it is an unpopulated place. You're left alone in there with your shame, right? And so, so I think when I talk about defensive anger, I'm talking about that, and it almost just becomes this, like, it's an ingrained, habitual way of responding to potential threats, and usually relational threats. And it just becomes sort of like the way of coping with your own experience of shame and trying to prevent more experiences of it in relationships. And so it's very common. I don't know too many people who don't carry around some defensive anger, and even those who look like they don't, it's in there. and if they don't feel it and learn what to do with it, then it can cause all sorts of other complications with life. So, that's what I mean by defensive anger.
Yeah, and this is one of those things where, I'm thinking about what happens with a lot of couples where they'll try to start to solve some kind of problem or address some kind of issue, and they end up in this, defensive, counterattack, counter-defensive thing where, it's like, well, you did this, or, it's like, I always tell people, please try to eliminate the word you from your vocabulary unless it's I love you, you're wonderful, I'm glad you're in my life. But the why did you did, you always, you never. Yes. And then, of course, that's gonna trigger this defensive anger. It's like, I do not, and oh, by the way, you do X and Y. It's like, oh, gosh, no, stop.
Oh, it's such a great point that, like, your defensive anger will trigger someone else's, and then things sort of escalate from there. In my book, Lovable, I actually call this part of us that comes to our defense our bodyguard. It's like our inner bodyguard that is like you hired a long time ago to defend you, and it's just doing its job. And now if you really want to be in a relationship, you have to be like, all right, bodyguard, stand down. I'll call on you if I need you, but I need to stay connected and vulnerable right now, not angry and defensive.
Yeah, and that I really think is one of the challenges to defensive anger, is that it makes it impossible to connect, or at least it makes it really difficult to connect, which is what, one, we all want individually in our relationships, but I think the whole world needs to do a much better job of letting go of the defense anger, and it can be very, very difficult, especially when I'm triggered, to be able to take a deep breath and go, okay, what's this about, both with me and with the other person, which is like, again, how do we do this?
Absolutely. Yep. And I think, there's really no self-reflection in defensive anger. It's actually sort of a heady thing. Like, it feels really good and powerful to be in that position, and that's why you're doing it, so that you don't feel so vulnerable and at risk. And so in the moment where you choose to observe that defensive anger rather than act out on it, something really amazing is happening within you. Because when you think about it, if it's your false self that's feeling angry and expressing it, then what's the part of you observing it? And the reality is that's your true self. That's the self that you came into the world with. So in the moment that you observe your defensive anger, don't act on it, and become curious about it, you're actually returning to and inhabiting that true self you had from the beginning. And that's the part of you that is capable of vulnerability and connection and intimacy and closeness. So something really powerful happens in that moment of observation.
Well, it sounds like there's hope then. So I just want to remind you that this is Happily Ever After. It's just the beginning on webtalkradio.net. I'm Leslie Dories, and I'm talking anger with author and clinical psychologist Dr. Kelly Flannagan. And anger comes in many shapes and sizes, and as you're going to find out, it isn't all bad. But if it's taken up residence in your home, it can be a problem. The defensive anger that we were just discussing plays a huge role in hijacking conversations and turning them into fights, but it actually doesn't have to be that way. You can learn how to handle it in a much more productive way, and if you're ready to know how, I can help. So please give me a call or send me an email to schedule your Stop